Hello. Last week, we talked with Jason Shawn, who is both film critic for Nashville Scene and a longtime employee of the Belcourt Theater. This week, we continue with the Nashville movie theme by talking with Toby Leonard. Toby is the program director for the Belcourt. We also talk with writer and private investigator and educator Veronica Kavass about her love for that very theater. This is Nashville Demystified. I'm Alex Steed. Every week I talk with a relatively new Nashvillian about something I'd like to understand further, and then I talk with someone who's been here longer and presumably an expert in that area. Nashville Demystified is brought to you by Knack Factory, and we own this town. Knack Factory is a commercial video and content production firm in Nashville. We Own This Town is a collective of podcasters based in Nashville. One show that is also in the network you might enjoy is Liquid Gold, which is about beer, wine, cocktails, coffee, and all things in between. So I said this before, I started the show as a means of getting to know the city, its history, and the people in it. I'm a new Nashvillian myself, and so this is more or less an ongoing challenge to push myself to understand where it's been and where it's going, the city that is. I've already met some incredible and awesome people by producing the show. I'm excited to announce some upcoming collaborations with these folks. Increasingly, though, I'm realizing that producing the show is as much about better understanding the city I moved here from, which is Portland, Maine. People talk a lot about how Nashville is changing, and you'll hear that on almost every episode of the show so far. You'll probably hear it on every episode moving forward. Portland has gone through a similar trajectory, with rumblings about the coming change beginning to emerge at the end of the 90s, a noticeable shift in neighborhoods and character from 2010 to about 2012, and then an accelerated form of gentrification that left a lot of Portlanders my age, I'm in my mid-30s, and people who are older, feeling like the friend they had in the city had changed considerably. This is imagery I actually borrow from Veronica Kavass, by the way, who is on this show, but I talk with her at greater length in next week's episode. And she's going to introduce the Belcourt shortly. But in coming to Nashville, a city going through something very similar, it's given me a lens through which I can look at my own former home and to understand that 20-year shift a bit better. So case in point, while I respect and appreciate all the efforts Portland has made since losing its own art house theater, or theaters, I guess, I didn't realize how truly I'd missed having a theater of this sort close by until going to the Belcourt for the first time and other times since. For the Portlanders listening, a huge shout out to hometown hero John Courtney for doing everything he's done in every venue he's collaborated with to keep new, inventive, and cinema alive back home. I know there are other folks who are doing the same, but John is a beacon in my eyes. But damn, having walked into the Belcourt and seen the programming they have available from 9 to 5, which I've talked about here in the past, to Joe Bob Briggs' midnight movie marathons, to, as you'll hear about later in this interview, grim 4-hour Chinese films about the impacts of industrialization, I instantly fell in love with and felt a sense of longing for the institutions my Portland had lost in the first wave of changes that hit the city at the turn of the century. But enough from me on that. Here's what Veronica had to say about why the Belcourt is meaningful to her. And I should note that Veronica is today's, quote, new Nashvillian, though, reflecting the incredibly complicated nature of that term. She's not new at all. She's originally from the city. She was raised here and bounced around a bit as a teenager, and then again over the past decade. But she's back here and writing a book about the city's outsiders. And so she's not, in fact, a new Nashvillian in the traditional sense, but labels are tricky like that, aren't they? So here's Veronica.
My name is Veronica Kavass, and I'm a private investigator and writer and teacher based in Nashville. And I'm also a cinephile. And one of the best things about Nashville is the Belcourt, which is a nonprofit independent movie theater that's been around since I was a kid. And I've seen it go through all its transitions. There was a time where it was almost going to be no more. And there were people with Save Belcourt stickers on their cars, and there was this massive resurgence. I think that's when it became a nonprofit. Now it's one of the places in Nashville that's doing very well, and I'm very happy about that.
Yeah. What is the significance of a theater like that? And again, the contrasts are many, but like I came from a city where our last art house theater died 10 years ago, just died on the vine. And I realized like how conceptually important it is, but I didn't realize until I came to a place that had one that I was like, oh my God, this is heaven. What is the significance of a theater like that?
It does show that there are enough people in the city that want to go see these strange stories that are revealed in independent films that are often disturbing too. And that there seems to be so many people here that want to go see them and then talk about them. That does say there's something going on. There's like a thinking that's happening here. I just see indie cinemas that do well in cities, especially the size of Nashville. I mean, there is some sort of intellectual pulse. And that one is that one's moving at a pace that I like.
Yeah. I had the luxury of talking to a handful of the employees and longtime employees. People who've been there since the late 90s or early 2000s. And what I found interesting is like maybe it's because they're in, when you're like into something, you're in something and you're in the minutia of the day to day. And like really like your day to day is just like, oh, I just want this person to respond to this fucking email or whatever the thing is, that you just aren't aware of like how culturally significant you are.
Right. I know.
I was just like in awe of you. I was like, thank you for everything you do. And they're like, honestly, it's just like, you know, if I could just get this distributor to return my call, that would be great.
It's so true.
Yeah. They're doing God's work in a way. And it's important. What was the last, it doesn't even have to be the last one. Like what was like your most moving Belcourt experience?
Oh, that is a rough one to pin down. Well, I will say the last one I went to was really great. It was a silent film. It was a night where they had a series of silent films that they were playing that were mostly from the beginning of the 20th century. And they had live music accompanying it. It was sort of electronic music that just played along to these films. So it was like about an hour or so of just sort of watching and then hearing the way this music corresponded to it. I thought, this is really great. This is very kind of Nashville to bring a band in, or really, I don't know if they were really a band. They were different independent electronic musicians, but I thought that was really cool. This is cheesy, but I saw Requiem for a Dream there when I was a senior in high school. And there was something about that movie. When I saw it, it just made me want to be a movie person. Yeah. It was the thing that made me kind of want to be a filmmaker. And I'm not one, but it might happen. And I've worked on movies before. So strangely, it was that film. And now when I look at that movie, not that I do very often, I'm kind of like, really? Yeah. That's the one that got me into film and like Dogma 95 and everything else, of course. But it was. So that would have been a turning point moment for me. But I've just seen so many movies there that I feel like you would not ever be able to see at any major movie theater. And it's one of the places where I can go and feel satisfied, even if the movie's bad, which I've seen plenty of bad movies there too. I just that's one of my fixes in Nashville is Belcourt. I think that's a thing that like either you get that or you don't, and people who don't get it, it's fine. But like I always think about the fact that I think I know that exact moment. I remember seeing Requiem for a Dream in the theater. I remember like it being my exposure to understanding the Kronos Quartet. I remember it being like so many different things. I remember like the seats I was in, like I remember all that. And to think that at the very least, at the end of the day, with the 1,000 or so movies that they play in a year and sort of give space that don't get space 99% of the time, just to think about like if they just moved that one kid, to be like, oh, there's a bigger, more important world outside here. Yeah. You are honestly doing God's work. Like totally. That's more important than most of the things people say they're doing in the name of something bigger than them. Yeah, I agree. If Belcourt wasn't here, I would not be here. Yeah. That's part of the thing that's keeping me in this city. Ringing endorsement. All right. Thank you so much. So the Belcourt housed the first incarnation of the Grand Ole Opry in the mid-30s. It was the first home
after it grew out of an exclusively radio phenomenon. It being the theater, opened 10 years beforehand and began dabbling in art, experimental, and documentary films in the late 90s, as I understand it, though I could be wrong. I'm sorry if I am. In 2007, it was bought by a nonprofit coalition of art-loving weirdos who kept that trajectory growing and going ever since. Criterion recently acknowledged it as one of their favorites. Videoport, which was a legendary video store in Portland that got taken up by the confluence of gentrification and streaming a handful of years back, housed a robust inventory of Criterion films, partially housed under their incredibly strange film section, partially eventually under its own section, that I reveled in during my teens and my 20s, and I just learned so much from that. I learned what was possible. I covet places like the Belcourt down here and the work of curators and organizers and advocates like John Courtney, who I mentioned before up in Portland, for exactly this reason. They're making possible that spark, that self-recognition for other weirdos who haven't yet experienced it, and they're keeping that spark alive and fostering that flame in those who have. Anyway, I talked with Toby Leonard, who's been with the theater for nearly 20 years and now serves as their programming director. Toby is behind selecting many of the films that play there and doing the work necessary to get access to them. If you've ever had to do this for one movie, you realize this is a monumental task, let alone hundreds to thousands. And as far as I can tell from our conversation, he isn't as weird about thinking that he does God's work as I am about it, but here we are. Like a lot of Nashvillians, he's warm and laid back with a wry sense of humor. He'll talk about pretty much anything you ask about. But before we get to Toby, please subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen. Consider giving it a review if you can. Please, please, please. That helps. Sharing with a friend also helps. We're on Instagram and Twitter at Nashville Demystified, and we're on the man who thinks he should make decisions about what people who are not men can and should do with their bodies. That is Facebook. If you have any feedback you want to send to me directly or ideas about future shows, you can reach me at podcast@knack-factory.com, which is actually podcast@knack-factory.com. That's it. Here's Toby. How did you come in through your work with the Belcourt?
Okay, so back in 1999, this theater was dark for about a year and a half, I think. And a childhood friend of mine, Julia Sutherland, started a group to try and save it, because at the time they wanted to knock the place down, turn it into a Walgreens. Who the fuck knows what they were going to do with it? But at any rate, I got involved with her when they reopened it, and I kind of, at the time, I'd been working in like food service stuff, and so I just came over here and kind of helped do evening management, run the place, and eventually just came over here full time. And for a few years, from like 2000, when we reopened in 2000 to about 2002, I was doing mostly management, but also dealing with the amount of rentals that we had started to accrue, which is a pretty regular thing here. We do a lot of theater rentals, just even stuff that nobody ever sees. Right. Orthodontists in there looking at teeth on screen, just some gnarly shit like that.
You should consider selling additional tickets.
Yeah, and also like during those times, we're really nobody involved had ever run a movie theater before, so we were really just doing a whole lot of different things to try and make the place work. We were doing a lot more concerts then. We had, but Nashville's no shortage for 300-seat rooms, so eventually that kind of became less and less of a priority as time went on. But I guess it was sometime around 2004, my job morphed into programming. There was another guy who had been doing it at that time. For whatever reason, it just kind of, the two jobs just grew together, and I've been doing it ever since.
Yeah. Is there an advantage to you collectively not having had experience
Probably. I mean, I don't know what any level of experience would have brought to the table other than maybe just a little bit more or less expectation on what certain things are going to do, what certain films are going to do above others. But I think maybe if I had any leg up whatsoever is because I'm a Nashville native, and maybe that helped.
Yeah, because there's like 20 of you, right?
Yeah. You can count them on your fingers and toes.
It's like a high council from like Star Wars.
Right. Yeah, that's true. You know, but yeah, I guess if there's anything about it, you know, I grew up coming to movies here, and you know, I don't know. I guess maybe knowing the space, knowing the city, maybe I don't know.
Yeah. What do you think? Do you remember? So in that time from like '99 to like the mid 2000s, do you remember at what point like the personality of this place started to take shape?
Well, I mean, the personality of the building itself has been around for a long time. As for what our group brings to it, I mean, I think we always had a sense of where we wanted to go. We knew we wanted to be like a center where people can, you know, gather and discuss and relate to film and have it be just kind of a conversation place where that can all happen. Of course, key to understanding what's going on in cinema today is what's going on in cinema yesterday and the whole history of it. So that's kind of why we do as much repertory screenings as we do, meaning classics or, you know, in the case of 9 to 5 when he came recently. So we always kind of knew that we wanted to have an active program of classics alongside the new releases, but it took us a little bit to get to the point to where we could afford it. At first, when we opened up, we had like one movie in one hall playing 4 times a day, one movie in the other hall playing 4 times a day, which is how all the multiplexes all operate anyways. But, you know, some movies have no business playing on Tuesday at 4 o'clock, you know, so eventually we became more and more dynamic with our schedules and just showing more and more stuff. I think the first year I was a programmer of the theater, we showed 100 movies total. Now we're like 4 times that much these days. I think maybe last year was something in the upper 300s. I wish I had the exact figures on me, but I can furnish them to you.
Sure.
I'm sure that does no good for the podcast.
No. There's always a long meandering introduction. So
cool. Okay.
Can you just tell me like what this neighborhood is and what it was like when you opened versus what's happening now?
Yeah. Where do you live?
I live in Inglewood.
Live in Inglewood. Okay. I would say Hillsborough Village in the late 90s and 2000s was probably more akin to what Inglewood and East Nashville, for that matter, have felt like in the last few years, if you take out all the development. Right. It wasn't, you know, the pace of development at that time in Nashville wasn't nearly as what it has been recently. But yeah, I mean, you know, we're between Belmont University and Vanderbilt University. The residential neighborhood is, you know, the Belmont Hillsborough neighborhood is now you would be hard pressed to be able to afford a house in that area unless you're doing very well. At the time, maybe you might have been able to do that, but you know, again, that's 20 years ago. The Hillsborough Village, by and large, without this construction you see outside, has retained most of its character. We lost some buildings, we lost Cotton Music, we lost the boot play at Peabody Shoes. A bunch of places have gone out, and in their places have come some other franchises, if you want to call them, not necessarily chains. But I guess the funky and grittiness that this area might have had back then is not so much anymore. It's kind of moved around town.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know if that helps.
No, it does for sure. And I think like for a lot of people, like just the development over the past 5 years is hard to keep up with, let alone know what's happened in 20. What does it mean to be, both film focused and repertory film focused in a city whose primary interest is almost exclusively music, at least from a business perspective? Like, what does that change or any of your focus, or sort of hone any of your focus, or what is that? I mean, the history of this building itself is related to the city's musical history.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, from 1934 to 1936, we were the first stage of the Grand Ole Opry, which started in a recording studio in a high-rise downtown. At that time, they were just bringing people into the studio, and that was their audience. Probably couldn't fit any more than 30 or 40 people in folding chairs. I'm just imagining. But at that point, this place was, our main hall, the 1925 hall, had a balcony, could seat a lot more people than it can now. That's heavily ingrained into our DNA. Maybe that results these days because we do particularly well with music-related films. Right now, we have Amazing Grace on screen, the Aretha Franklin concert film. Do you see it?
Yeah, it's out here.
Yeah. But
a lot of tears.
Yeah. It's something like that for us will be a really good run. Right now, I think we're coming into our third or fourth week with the film. And we're also like one of the highest grossing runs in the country. The film's not a huge hit by nationwide standards, but for us, it's doing quite well. And compared to all the other theaters in the country, evidently, we're doing probably one of the top 3 runs of the film. So, music films definitely have a place here. They have for a long time. When you came to see 9 to 5 the other day, that was on almost every Monday, we have a music-related film. Maybe it's not a concert film, maybe it's not a documentary, maybe it's just got a #1 hit like 9 to 5 that's enough to, or like Dolly Parton in it, that's enough to say, oh, we can put that on Monday night. Hey, we got to set it off in a week or two, and
which I'm stoked about, by the way.
Which was like, it's a heist movie, but it had like, it had a platinum selling soundtrack, and it stars Queen Latifah.
Right.
Put it on Monday. So, I don't know. I mean, music and film are really closely related. I think, you're talking about form and aesthetics and sensuality of varying degrees. It's all a very personal experience. So to me, it works together. Yeah.
How did you get into film in the first place? I mean, things were finding what's available here was a fundamentally different experience 20 years ago than it is now. What was that like then?
Well, I mean, at the time, you could see certain films showing up at the Regal in Green Hills, for example, but it kind of only went so deep. That was really where we stepped in, I think, and still kind of exists to this day. But I mean, as far as me personally, it's just kind of always been, a top interest of mine. I've come from a music background, but again, I think they're very same as a natural progression for me.
Yeah. What were the movies then that sort of moved you to know that was special?
Well, you mean like when I was a kid or something? Well, I mean, I grew up watching the same movies everybody else did, Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark and that stuff. I put an age on me. I'm 45. I don't mind saying. But, like when I got...
You can put that down. It's not going to...
Okay. When I got I'm going to place down my coffee cup here. I don't know. I mean, I can kind of point back to seeing Blow Up for the first time and realizing that, there's something more to this form that I've not been getting. I'm not sure I understood it at the time. Talking about Antonioni's film from, I think, was it 19-something, late 60s, I guess, 66 maybe. But yeah, I mean that was a confounding experience. I watched it on VHS. It was just one series of things after another, which eventually a plot came into focus. But yeah, I guess that was the one that kind of got me interested in different kinds of cinema, and that was, again, that was something I pursued on my own, and yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
I guess that was the genesis of part of this.
It's just, it's funny because it's like I'm from rural Maine. To like get to the good video store, I literally had to hitchhike into a city, and they had
how romantic!
It was so good. They had a incredibly strange film section, which is what they called it, which is where all the Criterion stuff was until they broke out Criterion stuff in its own place, and that's how it just thinking about over the course of like 20-25 years, that's where I found like Black Orpheus, right? Watched Black Orpheus, loved it. I recently sent Black Orpheus, the soundtrack that I found at a used record store on vinyl, to my girlfriend's dad, who's a drummer and an academic. It inspired him to like get a turntable again, and like sort of like so just thinking about like the progression of like these movies and like how they impact us and like what that impact does to like everything around us is always fascinating to me.
Yeah, Black Orpheus is a great example.
Yeah, it's like talk about like if you just like grew up like watching like what was available, and then you watch Black Orpheus, and you're like, oh, this is novel. I didn't know this. Or Kids. Kids was, and I know that has like that has sort of local roots, but I remember like Kids was one of the first movies that came out that was like popular, but it certainly represented like another option. Yeah, Kids was a wild thing. I remember that playing here probably like a year or two after Harmony graduated from high school. Right. At that point he was, at that point he had been gone for a little bit, but it felt like that anyways. Yeah, I had to. I think you wrote it at 18 or 17 or something like that. Do you, what is it like to focus on film programming in a time where content is, first of all, called content, and second of all, considered to be relatively like fleeting or ethereal or disposable? Yeah, it is, isn't it? What was that movie that was on Netflix like 2 months ago, and it came out at Sundance, and everybody was talking about it, and oh man, I can't even remember the movie. Was it Velvet Buzzsaw? That was the movie. Okay. Did you see that? I don't even know what it is. It's gone into the hole, man. That's the disposable nature of streaming, but then without streaming, we wouldn't have a whole lot of other great stuff too. As far as there being too much stuff out there, maybe. I feel like maybe we occupy a space that people can set the Roku player aside and find something that is hopefully thoughtfully curated for them. I'm not sure if curated is my preferred term, but I don't know, maybe just, and neither is gatekeeper too. Both of them sound pretty arrogant. But I don't know, you got to cut through everything. Every Friday, 25 to 40 films open in New York and or Los Angeles. That, back in the era, prior to digital filmmaking, it wasn't, I don't even know what it was. It was a fraction of that. Right. But nowadays, you got to, okay, let's say if there's 25 films, starting with a conservative number, let's just say 5 of those are major wide releases, Avengers Endgame, whatever, maybe a kid's movie. And then maybe another 4 or 5 of them are kind of like that specialty art thing that we kind of have a foot in. And then another 4 or 5 are like, serious films are worth considering that we really should look at. And then the rest of them are just like going straight to iTunes or whatever, but with a token theatrical release that somebody is paying for. Right. And that's a considerable amount. And then there's probably 2 or 3 Indian films in there too, which that's a pretty major, there's a sizable market for Bollywood stuff all over the USA, including here in Nashville at the Hollywood 27, where most of those wind up. But I guess,
part of our job is to fork through everything that is maybe worth showing and then refine that even further. So what you have by virtue of us only having 3 screens, or 2.5 if you want to call it, because this upstairs one's pretty small, is that ultimately what we wind up with, hopefully, is kind of the cream of the crop of whatever's happening on any given month. Mm-hmm. So with new films, I try and open them within a month of New York and LA, because if you go too early, maybe you miss like the fresh air interview and the movie's already ended, and you get Terry Gross interviewing the filmmaker after we've already closed the movie. And I get emails, they're like, "Hey, why aren't you showing this?" I'm like, "Man, where were you last week? Nobody came." Or if you wait too long, there's just, every week there's another batch of movies that come out. So you kind of have to set some boundaries and some spatial boundaries in terms of how we get everything out there, and that's just talking about new releases.
Yeah, what's the role of a theater like this? Like you said, there are movie theaters that you can go to, and they sort of like release the movies that people go and watch because they are sort of familiar, or they're exciting, or they're big, or whatever. Like, what is the role of a theater that focuses on, I'd say, probably the 98% of what doesn't get larger exposure?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think the role is just that. We're a nonprofit. We exist in that realm that enables us to show films that we know outright that maybe 20 people are going to come to. We had a film last week called Elephant Sitting Still. And, it's a 4-hour film. It doesn't have an intermission. It's set in rural China, in an industrial area. It's kind of bleak stuff, man. We're not, but it's the only film this dude ever made. He made the film and committed suicide for some reason. But at any rate, we identify this film, and we want to show it, so we did it, and and we're right. It's less than 40 people showed up to see it, and that's fine, because those 40 people probably got a little corner of their brain tickled, Right. And I guess that is the other end of the economic scale. So you can look at it in terms of, this movie does really well and it pays for us to do this. Mm-hmm. Or these batch of movies. Last year we had a major hit with the Mr. Rogers documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor, which was a major hit everywhere. But it's not often that a documentary is the one that carries your entire summer, right. So I can look at it and say, oh yeah, look, we made all this money with Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers is going to pay for the depressing Chinese movie, I don't know.
Which Mr. Rogers, I'm sure, would be stoked.
Oh, he'd be totally stoked. Yeah, he'd love that. That's an extreme example, and I'm kind of like, maybe not doing treating the Chinese film so fairly by making that comparison. But we do keep a balance between showing the stuff that we feel like people should see, and the stuff that's going to kind of keep our doors open.
Yeah. What excites you about doing this?
It's discovery of stuff, Yeah. The discovery of seeing new films, the rediscovery of watching old films. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's just seeing a film I haven't seen in forever, mm-hmm. I wanted to come to 9 to 5, didn't make it that night, but, I would have loved to have seen it.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. It's at the same time, while there's this entire history of cinema that may be a little bit overwhelming to imagine pulling from, you can kind of set certain, you can kind of hone in on certain things and, and focus on those for a little bit before moving on to something else. This month we have a Cassavetes series going on the weekends. It's been on my list for years. I've been wanting to show these movies, but we also try and adapt to whatever's going on at the time. So maybe 2 or 3 years ago, showing Cassavetes films wouldn't have felt so characteristic of the times. For some reason, it felt right for this month. And Seymour Cassell passing away also kind of fed into that as well, because when a dude like that goes and he's so identifiable with a certain scene, the scene in this case being, Cassavetes, that we're like, oh, here it is. This is when we do it, So even though we've been wanting to show all these Cassavetes films for probably, I don't know, at least a decade, it just, sometimes we're like, something happens, you're like, there's the chance right there. So here we are.
How do you describe, you're originally from Nashville, how do you describe Nashville to people who are not from here or if they're like, what's that like?
Well, I think there's a lot of Nashvillians, and I'm not necessarily speaking directly about natives, or really just people who've been here for a long time, who bemoan all of these changes and all these things that we look at out our door, these new buildings popping up everywhere. To me, it seems like it's always been one long change, one long growth. Interstate 440 didn't used to be over here. It used to be a creek bed of some sort. It used to be a drainage area. That's one thing. I grew up near Green Hills. Green Hills was a couple of strip malls, it felt like, compared to what it is now. So I don't take as drastic a view on it, although maybe I'm taking a little bit more, maybe lately it's gotten a little bit amped up, but I kind of feel like all of the changes have come into place in a certain way that doesn't. Yeah, every time an old building goes down, we lose a little bit of character. But in my mind, I go back to an argument we were having over 20 years ago, where everybody was saying, "Oh shit! Well, look, if we keep growing out and expanding, we're going to turn into the next Atlanta." At the time, Interstate 840, which was supposed to run an entire circle around Nashville, about 30, 40 miles out, that actually. I think maybe my memory is skewed on this, but I feel like at some point we as a city decided, all right, we're not going to do the sprawl thing. 840 construction stopped. It literally stopped it. It only does like a partial semicircle around the town. Never got completed. As a result, that decision, which was a conscious one, was like, well, we need to build up from the inside and become a more central city where people actually live downtown. Well, that's kind of what's come to pass. So nowadays, in all of this construction, everything you see it seems to me, directly associated with the decision not to become a sprawling disaster. The desire to be able to drive from one end of the city to the other in under 45 minutes is still, I think, possible in certain times of the day. Whereas, not to drag Atlanta through the mud because it's a city that I really like, but it's so big, it takes forever to, and there is a theater like the Belcourt in Atlanta, and it's kind of down there near the Five Points area. And if you live in, outside of town, it's going to take you forever to get there. So, I mean, I'm not sure if that directly answers what your question was, but to say that your question was, how would you describe Nashville these days, correct? Or in general, I don't know. I mean, I think there's still a lot. It's just a laid-back place, I mean, the fact that whoever publications keep deigning as one of the friendliest cities in the country, yeah, I mean, that all seems pretty spot on to me. I mean, I'll cuss a motherfucker in traffic just as much as the next guy, but I don't know. It's still a great place to live, and even though it's going through a lot of growing pains right now, there's still a whole lot of charm and a whole lot of soul here.
Yeah, I think I said as much to Jason Sean in my conversation with him, is that, like, the first drama in the movie Nashville, like the first bit of drama in the movie, is Haven Hamilton telling the session musician Frog cut your hair, you don't belong in Nashville. So like the very first piece of contention you hear is someone determining like what was wrong about New Nashville.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know if Frog was part of the old New Nashville or not. But he did have a nice head of hair.
He sure did.
But, there's a lot of people in that movie that had nice heads of hair.
Yeah,
so, I mean, where does Haven Hamilton draw the line? He's got himself some big sideburns.
Yeah.
I mean, you remember the line, was it with the line from The Simpsons where Montgomery Burns tells Don Mattingly to trim his sideburns? Trim those sideburns, hippie! That's one of my favorite lines.
Oh my God. Well, I think that's a perfect ending point. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
All right, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Nashville Demystified. Thanks to Jesse LaFontaine for all things related to sound post-production. All of the music in this episode is by various artists, and you can see who by checking out our website. And each episode has a show-specific illustration provided by my longtime friend, that's a funny way to describe a friend, Tim Burns, who's an amazing illustrator. A lot of great episodes coming up, Black history, queer history, more from Veronica, who you heard from before. We have conversations about music here. We have a lot going on. So follow us in all of the places, subscribe and do all that. It really does help us. Thanks again for everything. Nashville Demystified is presented by Knack Factory, and we own this town.